Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be updating the Australian Survivor Power Rankings once again following week 5 or episode 14. And as usual, I'll be ranking these players based on how likely I think it is that they'll win the game from this point. And this was an interesting round. I mean, it was the merge round as well as the round immediately afterwards. And, there's quite a bit to talk about, both edit wise and gameplay wise. So as usual, I'll be ranking these players based on how likely I think it is that they'll win the game from this point. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the list. So starting things off at number 13, we have the Merge Boot, and surprisingly, the first member of the jury. And here we have Khan. And again, Khan was the Merge Boot here, and I'm not too surprised about that. I mean, in episode 13, he wins the reward challenge, which was individual. He has a confessional about winning it as well as how the game has changed. He's confident his idol will carry him forward. He calls himself a challenge beast after winning 2 individual challenges. Doesn't mind being a single in the game as it allows him to play his own game. He gets along with Sam, making him feel like he's in a good place. Later on, Sam says how close she is to him. Mark and Sam include him in the men's alliance. However, Mark questions whether he's too big of a threat. After the challenge, Mark is determined to target him. Even so, he's looped into Sam's plan to target Shael. He agrees to it. He has a confessional about being a single player and being close to Sam, Mel, and Michelle. He walks in on Mark and Sam arguing and presents himself as a mediator, not realizing that Mark is trying to target him. And then ultimately, he's blindsided with the idol in his pocket, and he becomes the first member of the jury. And overall, I'll admit that I started to get a bit fooled last week that Khan might have made a deeper run, as it seemed like he was surviving despite people knowing about his idol. And plus, it seemed like Sam genuinely trusted him, which I thought could have translated into this merge. But when contextualizing the entire season, it isn't too surprising that he went out here with the idol in his pocket. And he was clearly a big character during the pre-merge, and so much of his content was centered around his idol, whether it was him talking about it or hearing other people talk about wanting to flush it, that he was being set up as a big blindside to kick off the merge. Now, with all that said, I was kind of surprised with how much of his boot episode was dedicated to this rift between Mark and Sam, suggesting that their strategy of combining the alliances was easier said than done. We'll talk about that more when we get to Mark and Sam, but I was surprised by how close Sam and Khan's bond really was, even during this episode. I know I talked about earlier how, yes, there was a possibility he could have been the merge boot, but I thought that would come with Mark and Sam largely being on the same page and recognizing how big of a threat he was. But it only seems like Mark recognized that, while Sam genuinely wanted to work with him moving forward. And obviously, with Khan coming out of the game, that definitely weakens Sam's position. In terms of Khan's overall gameplay, I thought he played alright in the pre-merge. He did a solid job building bonds with most of his tribe, establishing himself as a leader figure there. Along the way, he finds the idol as well. As a swap, he does fine enough connecting with Sam and Jesse. Despite continuing to be perceived as a threat, he's able to skate through with there being bigger threats than Ben and Croc. And while he was blindsided at the merge, he at least had people like Sam and the twins that were willing to keep him around, even if they ultimately stuck with the majority when it came time to vote. Now, obviously, the biggest issue with this game was his threat management. Despite not being the main target at most of the tribals he attends, we hear people talk multiple times about turning on him. Some of that was due to him holding onto his idol even after making it public knowledge. Some of it was him winning 2 individual challenges that he didn't really need. Some of it was him putting himself out in front so early in the game to where people like Mark and Chrissy started noticing him. But through that, he was setting himself up to have a pretty tough road to the end, and despite having people like Sam that wanted to keep him around. On another note, I feel like he got pretty lucky at the tribal where Alex quits the game, where if that didn't happen, there's a good chance he would have been blindsided there, or at least been forced to play his idol. And while I can credit him with putting a target on Ben's back, I feel like Sam and Jesse deserve more of the credit there for getting the numbers on Ben. And even then, I don't know if that was the correct move for Khan, as Ben and Shael would have been massive targets ahead of him. So on the whole, I feel like Khan was a bit of a mixed bag. I think he was good enough socially and physically, but he had pretty bad threat management that caused him to be targeted here, and with the edit making him a big character throughout a lot of the pre-merge, while planting seeds of his eventual downfall, it isn't too surprising that he ends up going home here, and because of that, I'm here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and we have the other boot from this week. We have Mel. And again, it's not too surprising that we lose Mel here. I mean, in episode 13, she has a confessional about making the merge and getting to play with Michelle. After the merge feast, talks about being reunited with her twin. She then gets an intro package talking about her and Michelle being twins. She tells Michelle later on that Shael's a target. After the challenge, he's on board with the Shael plan, but obviously, again, not much from her aside from that. And then we get to her boot episode where she talks to Sam about the previous tribal. After the challenge, becomes a prime target once again, tells Michelle that she feels like she's being a target, and obviously through that, they agree to approach Mark and Jordan to flip things around. Approaches Mark about the vote, tells her that she's one of the targets. She tells him that she wants to target Josh, who she sees as a mastermind, says in confessional that Josh is the leader and is dictating people. She feels like now is the time to make a big move. She talks to Michelle about how people are uncertain about their vote. They agree they need to get the women together and break up the men's alliance. However, by the time the votes are actually read, the split vote that Mark proposed goes through and Mel is voted out. So overall, Mel was a non-factor for most of the season. I do appreciate that she at least got some content in her last couple episodes, but it was obviously not enough to make me consider her a serious winner contender. It's kind of baffling actually how purple she was. We constantly heard her name being mentioned as a potential target during the pre-merge, yet we rarely heard anything from her perspective or even see how she saved herself. And even at the point where she literally saves herself by winning a fire making challenge against Ben, she still wasn't getting any content. And then gameplay wise, she was at the bottom for most of the game. While it seemed like there was a chance she could have been at the core with Nina and KJ, she spends a lot of that pre-merge at the outskirts, partly due to being seen as a physical weakness. Despite having a numbers advantage at the swap, she's in a lot of danger during that stretch, where we hear multiple people say they don't really trust her. She realistically could have been voted out at any one of those tribals, and it isn't simply due to there being other threats. In fact, she does get voted out right before the merge and is only saved by the format of that tribal where she gets to compete in a fire making challenge. Now, you had to give her some credit for winning that fire making challenge, but still not great. And even at the merge, when someone like her could have flown under the radar, she's still being targeted. Mind you, that's probably due to her being there with her twin, but she's still targeted even after everything she's been through. And while we see her put up a fight during the last round to blindside Josh, it isn't enough and she's voted out. So Mel is someone I like, and I wish she got more content considering she's a super fan. And obviously we know now that, like her father passed away not too long before the show started, which could have been a major storyline for her. But she spent so much of the game at the bottom. Plus she was purpled in the edit, so admittedly losing her wasn't that big of a blow to the season. And because of that, I have her here at number 12. And with that, we are now moving to the 11 people still in the game and ranking them based on how likely I think it is that they'll win from this point. But at number 11, the person I think has the smallest chance of winning from this point is David. And again, he's sort of been at the bottom for the last couple weeks now, and this week didn't really do him any favors. I mean, he got no content in the merge episode, which is very bad. And then in episode 14, he talks to Chrissy about the previous tribal, and when asked, he tells Sam that they're targeting Shael next, which really amounts to nothing. So, I mean, again, what is there to say about David? He's been pretty invisible in the edit, and while he is in the majority alliance, I never get the sense that he's that integral to things. It sort of feels like he's just going along with them, and that once it gets down to that core, if that were the case, he'd probably be the first to go. And aside from that, there's no storyline for him in the edit. Not too surprising that he's at the bottom here again, so I have him here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and again, we have another person that's been largely invisible, although they certainly got a visibility spike this week, and here we have Michelle. And this week was okay for Michelle, but I feel like a lot of her content was circumstantial. I mean, in episode 13, she has an intro package with Mel about being twins, but even then, I feel like Mel was getting more of the content there. After the challenge, she's on board with the Shael plan, but obviously, by the end, we all know that Khan goes home. In episode 14, she talks to Sam about the previous tribal. After the challenge, Josh tells her that the vote will be split between her and Mel. In confessional, she says that's a bad idea to tell someone they're being targeted. And obviously, we see her and Mel try to get the votes together for the Josh blindside. She tries getting Jordy to say where the votes are going, but Jordy isn't giving her any answers. She has a confessional about wanting to stay in the middle, but ultimately she loses her sister in the process. And again, overall, I feel like this week didn't do much for Michelle. I mean, I do think that with her talks with Jordan and her confessional being in the middle, that I feel like she could probably survive for a bit by flying under the radar. However, again, I feel like other people have bigger storylines going for them, and I feel like we really have to see what's going to happen now that Mel's actually out of the game, and whether that confessional from Michelle is merely circumstantial or not. However, if Michelle does start to become this underdog, then we can definitely look back at that confessional and see that as her storyline moving forward. But ultimately, I don't think we are going to get that storyline. I feel like other people take up that spot as being the underdog. There isn't really much room for Michelle to maneuver there, and because of that, I have her here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have someone who I mentioned not too long ago, and here we have Jordan. And Jordan, again, has been getting a pretty weird edit. He got no content in the merge episode. In episode 14, Shael talks to him about her spot in the tribe. After the challenge, Josh talks to him about Mark's idol, but admits that he doesn't trust Jordy too much. Even so, they need to stick together for the next couple rounds. And then later on, Michelle tries grilling him about where the votes are going, but he won't give any answers. So, on the whole, I mean, Jordan has been getting a very weird edit where, on one hand, he has been getting a bit of a consistent presence, obviously stemming back to his time at the swap. But however, I feel like little of that content has been relatively positive, and little of it's been personal either. I feel like Jordan has just been kind of there, sort of thrown in when he's needed, and I feel like there's no real storyline for him being set up. Now, there is the potential for him, being involved with a Jordy blindside at some point. I mean, with Josh talking like about the plan and what Jordy told him, I feel like that's something that Jordan could be involved with moving forward. However, again, I feel like Jordan isn't actually winning. I feel like Josh has been getting more credit for talking about not trusting Jordy. Even Mark, of course, who is sort of in the middle of Jordy's whole beef with a lot of the tribe and where Jordy could potentially take control of the game, runs through Mark. And obviously we'll talk about that a bit later. And I feel like Jordan's sort of the least instrumental person there. So while I think he might have some longevity now that he's gotten past the merge vote, where I honestly thought there was a chance he could have been the merge vote here, but obviously he survived, and I feel like he'll probably make a deeper run at this point. However, I don't see how he wins even if he gets to the end. I feel like with some of these interactions, he might have some trouble garnering respect, but again, with the potential setup for his involvement in a Jordy blindside, I think that's enough to put him here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have someone who, again, I just mentioned, it's Josh, and Josh has a bit of a weird week here where obviously he has no content in the merge episode, which is a bit of a red flag. And in episode 14, Jordy talks to him about possible threats. Jordy tells him about Mark's idol. The two seem to agree to a Mark blindside at some point, but not immediately. After the challenge, Sam targets him. He tells Jordan about Mark's idol. However, he feels like Jordy is a bigger threat. He admits to this in confessional. He wonders whether Jordy can be trusted, and through that tells Jordan to not act on it as they have more votes to get through, but it's something to keep in mind. He tells Jordy that they should target Mel and Michelle next. He says in confessional that the men need to stick together while the twins are big threats. And then, of course, Jordy, and Jordan agree to the vote split, which ultimately goes through. Mel goes home, and overall, this was another sort of visibility spike for Josh. Again, he's sort of being presented as this mastermind, even though I feel like we're getting more credit from Jordy on that end. And Josh himself even seems to recognize that Jordy is a bit of a power player within this alpha male alliance, to where obviously he has to talk with Jordan about a potential Jordy blindside down the road. However, again, I feel like Josh isn't winning either. I feel like his content has been way too inconsistent for my liking. It's not great that he's, again, being perceived as the leader of the men's alliance, to where he's being a potential target as a result. However, again, the main thing going for him is that he at least has the potential setup for a Jordy blindside down the road. However, even then, I feel like Mark might get more of the credit when it actually comes time for that. And I feel like, again, with this inconsistency, with this negativity, I feel like that's enough to make me not super confident in Josh moving forward. So because of that, I have him here at number 8. Now I'm moving on to number 7, and this was a bit of a weird week for this person. And here we have KJ, and again, there isn't too much to say about KJ. I mean, in episode 13, Khan approaches her with the Shael plan. However, that doesn't go through. And then she gets no content in episode 14. And at this point, I'm not too sure what to make of KJ. I mean, she definitely got content right before the merge, talking a lot about her as a potential underdog, someone that's been infiltrating the men's alliance. However, we didn't really get that this week, where obviously some of that could be due to her just playing along and that she could get a visibility spike as the potential of an actual blindside gets closer. However, with this merge round being very important for one's edit and her getting little content that's meaningful in that episode, that's pretty bad for me. And I feel like, again, not what I'm looking for in a winner candidate. But again, she could still get a spike moving forward, could still be perceived as his underdog. But for now, I had to leave her here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and this is sort of an interesting person to talk about. I feel like, similar to KJ, this person has more of an underdog edit, but the thing that puts her above KJ is the fact that she actually got more content in this week, and especially in the merge episode. And here we have Shael, and this was an okay week for Shael. I mean, in episode 13, talks about being separated from Ben and how it's more motivation for her to win the game for the two of them. At the merge feast, talks to Khan about not having their partners in the game. Afterwards, it's revealed that she's Mel's target. She feels like she could be a target after losing immunity, but sure enough, Sam and Jesse are targeting her, and there is a bit of deliberation over whether to blindside her. However, ultimately, Mark gets his way and Khan's blindsided instead. And then in episode 14, she has a confessional about being on the bottom and feeling like she's on the chopping block. She talks to Jordan about the votes. She assumes her and KJ are the next to go. She knows people see her as a threat for her physical ability, so she needs to keep winning. Sure enough, she wins immunity, tells Sam that she'll vote out Mel, but aside from that, nothing else. And again, Shael's been getting a bit of a weird edit lately. She's clearly being set up as this underdog figure, where despite the fact that Ben's out of the game at this point, she's a single, people are still targeting her and seeing her as this big threat. And obviously, that's not great from a gameplay position, but I feel like edit wise, she has been getting a bit in terms of an underdog edit. However, what really drags her down, even still, is the fact that despite getting this content about her needing to win immunity, once she does have immunity, she doesn't seem to be super involved in the actual voting. Like, she seems to be more of a secondary figure in a lot of the actual strategizing, which isn't great. I mean, yes, it's great that she's winning immunity, getting content for being an underdog, but what is she doing beyond that to really advance herself moving forward? I feel like she will continue to be a target, and I wouldn't be surprised if she gets voted out in the next couple of rounds, perhaps as someone that doesn't win immunity in a position where people agree that she's a threat and should go. And I feel like, again, while she has been getting some underdog content, it's not really enough to elevate her too high. So because of that, I have her here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and I was kind of disappointed in this person's edit from this past week, as again, the merge round is usually an important round for someone's winner edit, but here she got virtually nothing, and here we have Chrissy, and again, there isn't too much to say. I mean, in episode 13, she has a confession about making the merge and how she's been flying out by the seat of her pants, but aside from that, no content. And then in episode 14, she and David talk about the previous tribal, losing Khan, and how little control Sam had. She has taken up the role as the chef since then. After the challenge, Mel talks to her about the Josh blindside after the other women have been included, and after some persuasion, she seems to agree to the Josh blindside. However, that doesn't actually happen, and she goes with the vote split plan to get rid of the twins. So overall, not that great of a week for Chrissy. Barely any content. She doesn't seem to be that instrumental in the actual voting. And again, with this being the merge week, her not getting that much content is a bit of a red flag. Not great that she isn't getting more than talking about making the merge, especially when there's other people that talk about it. But the reason I have her as high as she is because, again, she's gotten a more consistent content edit before this week, and even now I feel like there is some potential for her moving forward. However, I no longer really consider her that much of a winner candidate. I mean, not that I really thought she had much of a chance of winning beforehand, as I feel like the people we'll be talking about are far ahead of her. It's just that this was such a disappointing week for her that I feel like 5 is about as high as I can put her. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we're kind of moving into a new tier now. I feel like these next two people we'll be talking about have a sliver of a chance of winning. But at number 4, we have the lesser of the two options, and Jesse. And this was an okay week for Jesse, but not the best either. I mean, in episode 13, Jordy talks about reuniting with him. At the merge feast, Jordy tells him about Mark's idol. He tells Jordy that he sees himself sticking with the men for a bit before narrowing the field down. He feels like the two of them are underestimated. Later, Sam talks about how close they are. He then wins immunity, has a confessional about winning it and how it makes him confident. He tells Sam, Mel, and Michelle how things are different now that the tribes are merged. Later, Sam tells him that Mark wants to target Khan and how she's frustrated about it. He then goes off to talk to Jordy. Jordy tells him about Khan is being the bigger threat between the two. He's torn between the vote between making Sam happy and doing what Jordy wants. And then obviously we see at the end that Khan is blindsided. But then no content in episode 14 really, sort of a disappointment there. And overall, I feel like the big reason I have Jesse as high as number 4 is because of his relationship with Jordy and how big Jordy's edit has been getting lately. In that he also has his relationship with Sam, although that wasn't focused on as much as I would have liked, especially now with the merge. I feel like Jesse is someone that could still make a very deep run, and I wouldn't be surprised if he takes up Jordy's mantle after Jordy has a downfall at some point. But man, compared to Jordy, he just didn't get that much content this week. And with the other two people, the other pair still in the game, being people that I have a lot more confidence in actually winning the game, I can't put Jesse too high. However, he has enough merits there with his relationship to Jordy, obviously working alongside Jordy, but also working alongside Sam, who is a pretty big character in herself, is a big reason I have Jesse here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and obviously this person got a pretty big edit this week, and here we have Jordy. And what is there to say about Jordy? I mean, in episode 13, he has a confessional recapping his game so far. He feels good about his game and how far he's come, shown talking to his tribe about the experience. He then describes how the game can change and how the blood versus water twist matters a lot. He's particularly excited to be reunited with Jesse. After the reward challenge, talks again about making the merge, describes the breakdown of the tribe by pairs and singles. He then tells Jesse about Mark's idol. The two then agreed to stick together and that they're underestimated. Sam approaches him, hoping her bond with Jesse will extend to a relationship with him. They talk about how the pairs need to have each other's back. He then suggests using Mark's idol, which Sam didn't know about. Even so, Sam tells Mark that Jordy was the one to tell her about his idol. In episode 14, he has a confessional talking about the men's alliance. He asserts that the alliance wants to make logical decisions, but doesn't like how comfortable they've gotten. He wonders whether now is the time to strike. He asks Josh whether Shael or Mark is the biggest target, and sure enough, he tells Josh about Mark's idol. He speculates whether they had the votes for a Mark blindside, but beyond that, we don't really get that much from that in this episode. And overall, I mean, it's pretty clear at this point that Jordy is being set up as a pretty big character. I mean, he is a major force in the end game and definitely someone who's going to be a major obstacle towards Mark and Sam getting to the end together. And I feel like that was expanded upon this week with him knowing about Mark's idol and planting the seeds about Mark being this big threat. However, I'll also admit that Jordy is probably going to lose the battle at the end. I feel like Mark and Sam will eventually, like catch on to what Jordy's doing, and through that, Jordy could be taken down in some way. And we even see that to an extent where Josh and Jordan were talking about how they don't entirely trust Jordy. That's a possibility for Mark and Sam to pick up moving forward. So I do still think that Jordy is going to most likely lose the game. However, the reason I have him here at number 3 is because he has enough content there on his own to where if somehow Mark and Sam don't get to the end together, or if they're both taken out before the end, that I feel like Jordy is the next most likely winner. He's been the most developed character. He's the most developed game player aside from Jesse and of course Mark and Sam. And I feel like there's just enough there to put him here at number 3. However, I will say that he's still probably going to lose at the end. Now we're moving on to number 2, and obviously it's the same top 2 as it was last week and the week before that. However, the order was a bit interesting this week, and I kind of went back and forth over what to do here. But at number 2, I decided to put Sam. And I know I put Sam at number 1 last week, largely due to Mark going down a bit. And, you would think on the surface by watching this week's episode that trend would have continued and Sam should probably be at number 1. However, well, let's get into it. So in episode 13, she and Mark have a moment after the merge feast to reunite. She then has an intro package about her and Mark being on the first season. She talks about how they left their kid to play Survivor and how important it is for them to win. They then share their notes. She tells Mark about Khan's idol and how she's been searching for one herself. She asks Mark if he's been targeted, which he says he hasn't. She knows that her and Mark could be targeted for being a power couple, which did them in their first season. She describes how she's close with Khan and Jesse and hopes that their relationship will also extend to Jordy. She approaches Jordy, who talks about the need for their pairs to work together. Jordy suggests they use Mark's idol, which Sam didn't know about. And obviously she gets very frustrated that Mark didn't tell her. She talks to Mark about it, and Mark does reveal the information. She's the one to suggest the merged tribe named Lava, which is kind of a dumb name. After the challenge, her plan is to target Shael and feels like Jesse will go along with that. She feels like Shael is a threat. She's confident that with Mark on her side, they'll get it their way. She mentions being close with Khan. Later, she sits down with Mark to propose the Shael plan. However, Mark pushes back, saying Khan is a threat. Sam, though, asserts that Khan has been loyal to her. Mark claims that they already have a majority with the men, so there's no reason to keep Khan. Mark asserts that Khan would turn on her eventually. She has a confessional about how her and Mark are not on the same page. She's frustrated. She tells Mark she doesn't like being told what to do. Khan walks in on their conversation and makes himself a mediator. She says she feels like she's being silenced. She feels like Mark is too focused on Khan, which is taking away his focus on other threats. She then approaches Jordy and proposes the Shael plan. Jordy, though, feels like the numbers are on Khan already. She doesn't like feeling like a pawn when it appears that the men are running the game. She tells Jesse that Mark wants to target Khan, and then ultimately she doesn't get her way and goes along with the split vote plan to get rid of Khan. In episode 14, she talks to Mark about what happened. She apologizes but adds that she felt like she was being told what to do. She says it doesn't feel good to be lumped into Mark's alliance and be bossed around with no agency. They agree they need to find a way forward. The next day, she talks to Mel and Michelle about the previous tribal. She walks in, talks in confessional about how she wants to target Shael, but was being forced to go along with Mark's plan. We see the two of them make up again. She feels like the men assume they have a strong alliance, but wonders whether Mark has been blinded by them. She feels like she isn't the one in control. She asks Jordy and David who their next target is, to which David says Shael. Even so, Sam questions whether they really feel that way. After the challenge, she has a confessional about how she knew they should have voted out Shael. She's frustrated that Mark didn't listen to her, and now that Shael is immune, they need to vote someone else out. She knows there's a pecking order within the men's alliance. She feels like Josh is the mastermind, should be the target next. She talks to Mark about the vote and pitches the Josh plan. Mark says the best move is to make Josh and Jordan look like they're the ones running the group. Even so, Mark doesn't think it's the right time to target Josh. She says in confessional that she knows someone is going to pull the trigger, and it's a matter of whether her or Mark will have to pay for not making that move. As the Josh plan comes together, she has a confessional about the need to get out a man tonight. She recognizes the threat Josh presents, but also knows that it would blow up the alliance she's technically a member of, so she needs to ensure that she has the numbers. However, it turns out she probably didn't have the numbers, as she ultimately sticks with the men's split vote plan to break up the twins. So that was a lot there to go over, and again, I feel like Sam was the definitive top two in terms of win equity. I mean, there's quite a bit for her in terms of her talking about her strategy, her perspective on things, her sense of where she lies on her tribe. And obviously, with Mark and Sam getting into these arguments, it would seem that Sam is in the right and that Mark is being a bit too bossy and abrasive. However, I don't know. I decided to put Mark at number one because I feel like the edit has just been backing up Mark more. I mean, obviously, Mark gets his way. I mean, Sam talks a lot about things that Mark doesn't agree with, but at the end of the day, he goes along with those plans, probably because she doesn't have the numbers to do so. But I think also, like, if you look at the broader edit, I feel like Mark has been right more often than not. And I'll talk about that more in a minute when I talk about Mark. But I feel like Sam isn't really in it to win it as much as Mark is. And I feel like despite, like talking a lot about having agency in the game, that she has been going along with what Mark wants. And I feel like these game moves that have been happening between losing Khan and then losing Mel are moves that definitely harm Sam's position more than they harm Mark's position. And even when talking about Josh as a threat, I mean, we see later on that Josh isn't as interested in blindsiding Mark as Jordy assumes that he is. So that's something there. I feel like Josh could be on board with Mark and Sam to take out Jordy, who is currently the biggest threat to both Mark and Sam getting to the end. So I think there are some reasons why Sam should be possibly number one. However, I think when looking at the bigger picture, I feel like number two is probably the better place for her. So because of that, I have her here at number two. And now at number one, you know it, it's Mark. And again, I know I put Mark at number two last week. I felt like the whole idol business and Jordy talking behind his back and contradicting what he was saying wasn't the best look from Mark. And I punished him at the time for like that and really kind of not looking good in the edit. And it seems like from this week that that trend continued as well, as I mentioned with Sam. I mean, in episode 13 has a confessional about making the merge, getting played with Sam, fulfilling his strategy and combining their alliances. His goal is for one of them to win. During the merge feast, Jordy tells Jesse about his idol. Jordy then tells Sam about his idol, making Sam frustrated that he didn't tell her. Sam approaches him and asks him if he has an idol. She mentions that Jordy has told her about it. He has a confessional about how he was playing to tell Sam about the idol, but Jordy beat him to it. He pulls Sam aside and confirms he has an idol. He tells her that he wants to keep it a secret. Sam assures him that she would keep it a secret and that Jordy told her. She mentions that Jordy tells Jesse everything. In confessional, he says he wanted to keep an idol secret because it could make him and Sam targets. He reminds us that they were targeted early in their first season. This time, he wants to get Sam to the end. Later, he talks about his alliance with the men, Josh, Jordy, Jesse, and Jordan, and how they are a force to be reckoned with. He asserts that his plan is to include Sam and Khan in this alliance, even so he wonders if Khan's idol makes him too big of a threat. After the challenge, his goal is to target Khan. He sits down with the men and proposes a vote split between Khan and Mel. He feels like even if Khan plays his idol, it would break up the twins, which would be good. He feels like Sam is to go along with the plan, but obviously Sam doesn't seem to be on board with the plan, saying that Khan isn't as big as a threat that Mark makes him out to be. He seems particularly frustrated that Sam isn't on the same page, which isn't the best look. Despite most of the episode focusing on Sam's frustration with him, Mark ultimately gets his way as Khan is blindsided. And then in episode 14, he apologized to Sam for what happened. Sam tells him that she wished he would understand her perspective. She feels like she was being told what to do. In confessional, he says he and Sam disagree sometimes. He asks that Sam fell under Khan's spell and he needed to take him out. The next day, he has a confessional talking about how big of a win it was to blindside Khan. He asserts his alliance is a dominant group. After the challenge, he and Sam talk about how the vote where Sam proposes Josh, but Mark isn't on board. And despite most of the episode focusing on the women's efforts to get the Josh blindside, Mark gets his way, splits the vote, and breaks up the twins. So, again, on the surface, it doesn't seem like this week was too much better for Mark. I mean, obviously, a lot of the merge episode focused on his disagreements with Sam, and that wasn't the best look for Mark, as it seemed like he was bossing Sam around. Also, his talk about the men's alliance dominating the game seems like the type of fodder that you'd see in episodes where obviously a group like that gets flipped on. So, not great. And obviously, also the idol stuff is still not great for Mark. However, the reason I decided to put him at number one is because I feel like, yes, while he is presented negatively for a lot of these episodes, I feel like the edit is sort of backing him up. I mean, first with the Khan stuff, I mean, we saw him way back in the pre-swap even that he knew that Khan was a big threat and that he would align with him for the time being, but knows that he would eventually take the strike against him. I said that when Khan was being set up for a downfall, that Mark had a good chance of being involved in that actual move, and that ended up happening. He was a major figure behind the Khan blindside, following up on that storyline. All that stuff is great. There's also the fact in this most recent episode where obviously we hear Sam talk about how big of a threat Josh is, and while that's true to an extent, we hear from Josh that he's actually kind of trying to protect Mark to a certain extent, where obviously Jordy tells Josh about like Mark's idol, and Josh seems to be on board with the Mark blindside, but then talks to Jordan about how he doesn't trust Jordy as much as he trusts Mark. So, and the fact that Mark wants to keep Josh in the game, to potentially save him from that is probably a good move. I mean, it's probably a good thing that Mark is keeping Josh in the game, as it's possible that if that Josh and Jordan storyline of wanting to flip on Jordy comes to fruition, that Mark will be able to latch onto that and really win out that battle. And again, I feel like Mark and Sam will win that battle over Jordy. I mean, there is still the possibility that they could lose, but I feel like the odds are definitely in Mark's favor. And again, the fact that he gets his way at both of those tribals, and yes, while he does seem a bit bossy in the process, I feel like the edit in the grand scheme of things is proving him right. So I feel like there's a lot going in Mark's favor, even if it doesn't seem that way on the surface. And I feel like those are all things that are makings of a winner. So while I think Sam would be the most likely winner if Mark is surprisingly taken out at some point, I don't think this week's episode is enough to disqualify Mark from being a winner candidate. And I feel like he is still the person most likely to win Australian Survivor, Blood versus Water. And there we go. That will do it for this week's Power Rankings. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And as usual, I'm going to be back next week breaking down these Power Rankings again, seeing how the season is moving forward. Big Brother Canada is starting today, which should be pretty exciting. I plan to cover that series as well. And we are also only 1 week away from Survivor 42. So obviously I'll be covering that. Should be a preseason power ranking for that coming out before the week is over. So stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.